everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Winetta Ayers. I'm Executive Director for Commonwealth North, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today. We're especially glad to be partnering with the Alaska World Affairs Council for this event. And so whether you're joining us in person here today or watching the recorded program later, we thank you for your time and your interest in today's topic. Let me do a couple of acknowledgments before we get started with the program. First, we want to acknowledge that we are coming from the traditional homeland of the Dena'ina Athabascan people, and we further acknowledge that Alaska is the traditional homeland to 228 Alaska Native tribes. And so we're grateful and give thanks for the diversity, resilience, and generosity of Alaska's Indigenous people. I should also note that if we were coming from Canadian homelands, Canada is home to 617 First Nations people, so that's quite a tall order for our Canadian friends as well. We also want to acknowledge the assistance of our volunteers. As always, Carol Anderson and Margaret King are with us today to help with registration and getting everybody checked in. We'd also like to thank Lisa Eiler and Siobhan Choi with the Alaska World Affairs Council for their assistance and partnership in putting together today's program. We're also very grateful to Alaska Communications and ConocoPhillips as our program sponsors in 2024. And we always want to say thank you to our members. I know for both Commonwealth North and the Alaska World Affairs Council, we're a membership-based organization. Members are very important to us. So we appreciate the support of our members and invite those of you who are not members to consider joining either or both of our organizations. And we have membership information available on the tables and in the reception area. So please join me, if you will, in acknowledging our volunteers, sponsors, partners, and members. So again, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Canada-Alaska Arctic Relations. Our format for today is that first we'll hear from our guest, Deputy Ambassador Cohen, and following her prepared remarks, she'll be joined by Marianne Peace, who's an Emeritus President of Commonwealth North, along with Lisa Eiler, who's the President and CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council, for a discussion. And while they're continuing on with the conversation, we invite you as members of the audience to also be part of the program by posing some questions for the ambassador. There are blue index cards and pens on your table, and we invite you to write down any questions that you may have so we can continue the discussion and exchange of information. So to introduce our guest speaker today, I'm pleased to welcome to the lectern Marianne Peace of MAP Consulting. Marianne is also the Canadian Honorary Consul General here in Anchorage, and she's an Emeritus President of Commonwealth North, and we thank her. Marianne.
Well, thank you all for joining us here today, and I think we have another person that we need to mention in the audience. Karen Mathias was the Honorary Consul of Alaska and also the General Counsel for Alaska for Canada, so thank you for joining us today. I also want to point out that my son, Teddy, is up here this week. He's with Tote Maritime, and they're a big sponsor of the Arctic Symposium. And it's always great to have him in town because I gain a few pounds with his cooking. And of course, Natalie and Megan are here at the table as well with a Deputy Ambassador and Head of Mission, Sara Cohen. Sara, it is such a pleasure to have you here. You are the Deputy Head of Mission for Foreign Policy and National Security at the Embassy of Canada to the United States, based in Washington, D.C. As part of the Embassy's senior executive leadership team, you oversee foreign policy, defense policy, energy, and the environment. That's always at the heart of any Alaskan discussion. Public safety, border security, immigration, intelligence, and law enforcement. As a career diplomat, you have represented the Canadian government throughout the Americas, including assignments in Washington, D.C., Bogota, Colombia, and Santiago, Chile. And we actually have someone who is working on a project in Santiago, Chile back there, Keith, and so you're going to have to talk to him at some point as well. It's a great pleasure to invite you and Ambassador Cohen to Alaska and to the lectern to share your insights in our common interests in the Arctic, energy security, and national defense. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Cohen.
Thank you. All right, so my turn to do thank yous. So, Marianne, honorary consul, honorary Canadian, thank you for the kind introduction. My turn also to thank the World Affairs Council, Commonwealth North World Affairs Council. Mead Treadwell, thank you for being with us. Karen, I blew in too fast to give you a hug, but also thank you so much for being with us. Of course, all the members of the boards of directors and those who've just come out to enjoy this session today over lunch. Can I put this here? All right. Right there? Okay, are we good? Excellent. So thank you for coming out to hear me speak. This is my second time here in Alaska, and I can't tell you how excited I was to get on that slightly long trip from DC and come back up for Arctic Encounter this year. I had the pleasure of coming last year where we had a good showing of on the Canadian side, and huge thanks always to Megan and to Natalie for everything they do for our team based in Seattle to represent our interests up here in Alaska. I would say we have a much larger Canadian presence here this week, and so for those of you who are intersecting with the symposium and who'll be in and out in those sessions, I hope you do get to hear from the wide range of Canadian players, including the Premier of Yukon, including the Minister for Canadian Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, myself, a variety of others who'll be telling a little bit more about that Canada-Alaska, Canada-Arctic story. You're getting a bit of a trial run of my remarks, which will be on Friday, so hopefully you can help me refine them over time. I thought maybe I would just start with, so Marianne explained who I am and what I do in the embassy. I think the sort of the joke that I like to make about that portfolio is I work on everything about the Canada-US relationship that doesn't actually make us money, but that if it doesn't go well, the money stops flowing, the trade stops happening, right? And that is where you get the environment piece, and that is where you get the energy piece, and that is very much in the year and a half that I've been doing this, where you get the Arctic piece from a pure shared environment, shared homeland, shared domain perspective. I am 100% a total dilettante in this space. I live in the lower 48. I am a Southern Canadian. Our Southern Canada is a bit further north than your South, but I am very much what is considered a Southerner in this space. And the longer I spend talking about the Arctic, talking about Canada and the US, Canada, Alaska in the Arctic, the more it's pretty clear to me that the people who are in the Arctic, who are in the North, who know these issues, you're the ones who know these issues. Our folks in the North and in the Arctic are the ones who know these issues. So my role is to tell the story. My role is to understand more, to ask questions, to get that message out. But my role is very much not to pretend that I'm an expert in things that people who have lived and worked and made the money and kept the homeland safe for decades, for generations. It's not my job to have opinions about that, and it's not my job to tell people what to do. But I do try to tell that story. And I think part of that story for Canada, if you sort of start with what the Arctic means for us, I mean, we're talking about 40% of Canada's landmass, and we are the second largest country in the world. It's 75% of our coastlines. We have 3 oceans. 75% of our coastlines run through our Arctic space and our northern space. 150,000 Canadians, which doesn't sound like a lot. 50% of them are Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit. And so that's very much about people. And when you look at our approach to the Arctic and to the North, it's about our obligations to our people, it's about service delivery, it's about keeping people safe and secure, the rights and the opportunities and the obligations we have in that space to make sure that the opportunity is there, but also that is done in an environment that is safe, that is done in an environment that is protected, and that is also physically and security-wise safe. And I would say that is Canadian English for Homeland Security. I had the enormous fortune to spend 5 days in Resolute a couple months ago. Resolute is our second northernmost community. It sits in the middle of the Northwest Passage. Population 200, mostly Inuit who live in a hamlet there. If you scope and scale that across 40% of the Canadian landmass, you start to understand what it means to actually have to talk about service delivery, security, food security, economic security, and also physical security. And I think that was a real eye-opener for me, for sure, but I think is a good sort of way of situating what our approach is through our Arctic national policy framework, or Arctic and Northern policy framework, and where you get enormous alignment, I think, with what I see from the US government's approach to the Arctic as well. We use different words, we have different framing, we put people at the top of that to have a conversation that's about security and stability. But it's a framework that evolves over time in order to guarantee some of these spaces. And if you look at the US approach, that is also very much about people. And I think that is a really important segue to the Canada-Alaska conversation, because the people of Alaska and the way in which the people of Alaska are talking to the people of Yukon, the people of British Columbia, the people who you share this environment with, but also the people further north in Canada, where there are so many similarities on a community-to-community basis in terms of the threats, the challenges, the opportunities. The Canada-US border is 5,500 miles. I'm sorry, I have to read my notes on this because kilometers is a little bit more where I go naturally. 1,500 miles of that is between Alaska, BC, and the Yukon Territory. So that's almost a third. I spent a lot of time, you've heard from my bio, talking about border security. Well, so this is a third of that. And Alaska is how the US is an Arctic nation. And so we can't have this conversation about Canada and the US and the Arctic without having the Alaska conversation. I made a joke about how I don't focus on the money and the trade, but a big chunk of this people to people and what it means to be Canada and Alaska in this conversation is very much about mutual prosperity. We are in a space right now in the embassy where we're talking about mutual dependence a lot, where we're talking about the friendship between Canada and the US in an increasingly scary world where it's not safe to have neighbors. Well, Canada and the US, and therefore Canada and Alaska, is a story about neighbors keeping each other safe and making each other more prosperous. Just a few stats. So Canada's daily trade, Canada is the top destination for US exports worldwide, more cumulatively than Japan, China, and India combined for the US market. Of that, $4 million in trade daily between Canada and Alaska. That's mainly in the natural resources space. We're a proud mining country, you are mining people. Oil and gas is also a big part of that. Seafood's a big part of that. $500 million in goods are exported from Alaska annually to Canada. 80 million in services. 47 Canadian-owned businesses operating here in Alaska, creating 4,350 jobs, 268 million in salaries. Big names, Teck, North Pacific Seafoods, Canaway Seafoods. ConocoPhillips, also not a Canadian company, but very much part of that Canadian story. And when you look at those Canadian stories that involve Alaska, that involve the Canadian pieces of that value chain, Teck's a really good example where the zinc is coming from Alaska and it's being smelted in Trail, BC, and then goes onwards. And that's all part of a very modern and future-looking story about let's be friends and make the opportunities exist on both sides of the border because we know who we are, we know who our values are, we share them. And Alaska and Canada are very much part of that story. There's also the people piece of that. We have 1,000 Canadian personnel serving with NORAD. Last time I was here, I went out to Elmendorf to meet with some of the Canadians and also the Americans who are there. We've got about 40 of those Canadians who are physically based at Joint Base Elmendorf. I would tell you every single one of the ones I spoke to told me they want to retire in Alaska. So that is, again, part of this story of how Canadians come to this side of the border, Americans go to our side of the border. We know each other, we know how each other lives. The people who are in it know what needs to get done and also know how to do it together. And so that's a very important part of the message. I'll use that as a bit of a segue to the defense piece because it is a big chunk of my portfolio and it's a big chunk of the conversation that we're having right now with the US government about how what we do in the Arctic is so fundamentally important, and what the US needs to be doing in the Arctic by virtue of Alaska being an Arctic part of the country, but also the work we do together with our piece of it is very much about hemispheric security, keeping each other safe. But it's also very much about the way in which we work together. So NORAD, very Alaska story, the only binational command in the world. And when I talk to the Brits in Washington about this, they're kind of like, you have NORAD, and NORAD is really cool. So that is high praise from my British colleagues. This is a conversation at the highest levels of the government between Canada and the US at all times. It's part of our Canada-US roadmap. We launched in the last 4 or 5 years a Canada-Arctic dialogue that is specifically designed to get at bringing all of the pieces of this story, the environmental piece, the natural resources piece, the science piece, the trade piece, the critical minerals piece, the what do we do about the fact that the Arctic is melting 4 times faster than anywhere else, and that brings real challenges for communities that only those people who are kind of in them know how to address. But it's also very much about fixed assets, it's also about the defense space, it's about hypersonics, it's about nuclear submarines, it's about under the sea, over the sea, it's about in the air. NORAD's kind of the heart and soul of that, right, since 1958. And what we've seen in, what we have done in Canada is a very deliberate path of investing robustly in what Canada is able to bring to the table in that conversation, to keep all of us safe. Because the hemisphere is what it is. We are friends by virtue of all of the reasons why geography makes that important, but all of the reasons why our respective democracies have evolved to have the same values and to have the same priorities. So a few highlights even before I get to what we're doing with specifically NORAD, just in terms of the rather rapid pace of investment in the last few years in the military and the defense space. We have 6 new Arctic and offshore patrol vessels, 4 of which have already come online and 2 of which will be online by next year. We've bought 88 new F-35 fighter aircraft, which will be coming online in the next few years. We have a new remotely piloted aerial system with 11, sorry, I have to read my notes on this too, General Atomics Sky Guardians coming online. We're investing in space-based surveillance, and we have 16 brand new P-8 Poseidon aircraft that we've just announced the purchase of, which will really make it possible to be completely interoperable with the US and other allies. That's even before we get to our announcement in 2022 that Canada will invest $38 billion over 20 years to modernize, for our piece of modernizing NORAD. Just a word on numbers, our economy is 1/10 the size of yours, so you have to multiply these numbers by 10 to get a sense of what the scale is that I'm talking about. But that is very much about northern basing infrastructure, that's about satellite comms, and about over-the-horizon radar, which will allow us really very much to see all of the things that bounce across the horizon that you wouldn't normally be able to see if we weren't working so closely with the US to make sure that we're covering every number on that dial. It works very much like a clock. So we'll have like from 10 to 2, and then you'll have the rest of it, and then we'll be able to see the whole landscape. The range of mechanisms in which we talk to the US and which we talk to Alaska about the Arctic is a bit mind-boggling, and it runs from the Arctic Dialogue that I mentioned, and I was up in Ottawa for the second meeting of that. We did a bunch virtually during the pandemic, but the second in-person meeting of that, which took place in February. Also, all of the consultation that we do very much in the military space with our permanent joint board of defense, the intelligence space where there is regular and constant contact, Canada and the US bilaterally, but also with other NATO allies, with other Five Eyes partners. And it's very much about more than kit, because the training component, a big part of the trip that I was on in Resolute involved a number of US 2-star generals who are already very much involved in our regular training exercises, talking as well with the Brits and the Swedes. As NATO expands, and as we look at the Arctic as a place where we all need to be ready for whatever is happening next, I think there's widespread recognition that the North American Arctic is the place to do that, where we are already doing the training with the US, where we do the training regularly, and where other allies are going to have to come on stream to understand what it's like to work in an environment like that. Again, to my point, those who are in it really know what it looks like. So let's leverage the extent to which those who are in it are able to teach that and share that with others. And that is something that is very much shared between Canada and the US, and is something that is very much a big, powerful part of that brand. You are hearing for the first time, because it was announced yesterday, what I can share with you about our defense policy update. So I thank the Prime Minister for announcing that the day before I get to speak to you at this luncheon, but this is a generational, monumental investment for the Canadian Armed Forces to the tune of $8 billion, again, just do that upscale please, over 5 years, $73 billion over 20. And when you read through those documents, which I have been doing for the last 24 hours, I think the first thing that jumps off the page is how much the Arctic is the opening salvo of a conversation about why the Canadian Armed Forces needs to make generational and very significant investments. The language we are using is that it is time to vigorously assert our sovereignty in the North. Well, that is a conversation that is not only about the Canadian North, it is about the North American North, and it is about the continent, and it is about the hemisphere. And that is very much where I do see a lot of alignment with what the US government is talking about. I see a lot of alignment with what I hear when I'm in Alaska from people who very much know what the threat looks like and very much feel the impacts. And so through that, you see very much an analysis that we have all come to, and we looked at this very closely in line with documents like the the National Security Strategy and the US Arctic Strategy. There is no greater threat right now than what is coming through the Arctic, and that is very much the back door also of what NATO is looking at in the European transatlantic space, is also very much the back door of what we are all looking at in the Indo-Pacific space. And so we're doubling down, actually quite literally. It's if you count up all of the investments that I've just detailed and a number of investments in the other space and then these investments, we have pretty much doubled our investment in the forces in the last 10 years. We'll have northern operational support hubs. We'll have airborne early warning aircraft. We'll have maritime sensors to patrol the coast. Like I mentioned, 75% of our coasts is in the Arctic. Satellite ground stations, tactical helicopters. We're looking at options in the cyber space and satellite space, long-range missiles, submarines, long-range precision strike capacity, ground-based air defense, and the possibility of vehicles who can actually operate in this environment. So this is the sort of newest tranche of, I think, what we've been building up to in the last little while, and where those conversations, Canada and US bilaterally, those conversations that we have here in Alaska when people like me come up, but also through the work of our various other folks, and very much building on the conversations that happen when people like me don't get involved. I have to say, every time I meet with representatives here in Alaska from the government, met with the governor recently, met with some folks today in the administration, but also last time I was here, I'm struck by the number of times that people have mentioned, oh, in the last year I was in Canada 12 times talking about a variety of things. Those are conversations that neighbors have. And sometimes neighbors do disagree on things. Where do you put the fence? I don't like the color you painted the door. But we resolve those issues in a condominium board kind of way, because we are also all focused on the greater goal here of keeping the neighborhood safe so that our kids have a place to play, so that everybody can buy a decent meal, so that the overall environment is safe, and so that people are very happy to continue living in that space and being neighbors with each other. I will leave it there for the prepared remarks because I get the sense that there will be more questions.
Oh, yes.
But very happy to be here and very happy to have a chance to share these thoughts with you, and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Where do you want to have a seat? Okay.
Do you want me to grab the mic?
Yeah. And Lisa.
And Lisa, why don't you join us as well? Thank you very much. And as everyone knows, Commonwealth North is very much a public policy organization. And we are looking forward today to the dialogue and some of the questions. There are blue cards on each of your tables, and if you could please send them up here, we would be very happy to ask those important questions. Let's start in the back table there. Mead, I'm sure you have a question. Please go ahead. Let's start with you.
And the cards forward. No longer anonymous, but thank you.
I'm going to pass this over to Canada was initially unsupportive of ballistic missile defense. Will NORAD and the Northern split on this difference? What is Canada's view on missile defense today?
NORAD and NORTHCOM split.
Oh, NORTHCOM, sorry.
We're starting with the softball questions, I take
Yeah.
it? Yeah, okay.
That must have been Mead's.
So there are details about this in the defense policy update. It's a tricky issue for us, and I don't pretend to have the future crystal ball on this one. It's an ongoing conversation. It's a live conversation and has been for my time in government. I happened to be posted in Washington when the decision was originally made and conveyed, and familiar with the reaction to that. But I don't have a timeline for you, and I don't have a prediction on where this is going to go. I think this is a conversation like any other conversation about defense that needs to continue happening as we look at what the threat is, and we look at what the toolkit is, and we look at what the choices have to be made within that. So yesterday's announcement outlined a number of choices and a number of investments. It's not the be-all, it's not the final, and it bakes into it opportunities to review every 4 to 5 years, which is new for us. You have a national security strategy that is periodic and that is regular. This is the first time that that is being signaled in our space. But at the moment, no, we're not in it. Still.
Well, I'm really glad we started with the softball, got that one out of the way. I also see, can you talk a little bit about the innovative programs and policies in Canada looking to reduce carbon emissions?
Yeah, thank you for that. So the one that I am most familiar with right now, having just spent a few days in Houston, which really is quite south, by all of our metrics, is what the government of Alberta is doing on carbon capture, particularly around oil sands. Big part of the Alberta economy, 62% of US oil imports are from Canada, and most of that is from the oil sands. And a lot of the innovative work that has happened in Alberta has very much focused on carbon capture. And what we've seen from the metrics is while oil production has increased, emissions have stabilized, which suggests that the carbon capture very much is working. That is one place where we are looking at that. The transition to green forms of energy, solar, wind, but also very much the critical minerals, electric vehicle space, is something where we are on pace with a very aggressive strategy. That was, I think, an announcement of $2.3 billion over 5 years to ramp up all 5 stages of that value chain. I mentioned the tech trail connection. That's very much a joined up Canada-US conversation about how do you accelerate extraction in Canada, as well as uptick in refining, processing, manufacturing, recycling, but in a mindful and deliberate way, so that given the extent of the investment needed to meet the challenge, we're not duplicating efforts across the board. So let's do that in a deliberate way where we're building, like we did in the auto sector, a value chain that will drive us all towards meeting our 2030 goals, lowering emissions, increasing the uptick in electric vehicles, and then also very much in other forms of energy. I had some interesting conversations about hydrogen when I was down in Houston, but also wind and also solar and also electricity, where I think like 99% of your electricity imports are from Canada. So, you know, there's transmission lines and infrastructure is always a bit of a challenge, but I think all of that feeds into the answer to how are we looking at reducing emissions. We're looking at doing it in a very joined up way with the US across all aspects of that energy landscape.
Excellent. Lisa,
All
You have a
right.
few there.
I do have a few here. What is the most pressing security issue faced by women in the Arctic, in your opinion?
Oh, see, now I want to do personal opinions. Okay. So that is a really interesting question. The standard answer is that the biggest crisis facing the Arctic right now is the melting of the Arctic. Because what that does in terms of opportunities, what that does in terms of threat vulnerability, those two things are actually linked. And you can talk about opportunities while also talking about threat. What that brings into the mix is a conversation about foreign actors and malign actors, and that's absolutely a big part of what we talk about when we talk about threat. I think when you talk about women in an isolated space, in an economically perhaps less developed space, you bring in a lot of questions about, are we able to protect women and take a very multifaceted approach to what the needs of women are. I don't pretend to speak to the needs of all communities across the North. I spent a grand total of 5 days in one community of 200 people. But what I would say is that is a very complicated space where protecting and empowering elders, local knowledge, channeling the wisdom of the women who have run these communities and been players in these communities is very important. And where we do see enormous challenges to the social fabric, to the social culture, to families. I was in a community where there are 80 school-aged children, about 40 of them are going to school. The sort of ways in which women have to address those challenges. We do have challenges with addiction in the North. We do have challenges with food scarcity in the North. And I think all of that is part of a really complex web of challenges that need to be addressed in this very deliberate way where you are actually going out and talking to people about what their needs are. And coming up with policies that are about, again, talking to people who are in it and figuring out how to address those things. I've skirted the question a little bit because it's uncomfortable space. But I think as a woman who works in national security, these conversations are really important because national security is one thing, but sometimes we're talking about domestic security, we're talking about personal security, and we're talking about giving voice to people who've never really been part of those conversations.
Thank you. Good. I'm gonna do one more. Would you talk a little bit about the icebreaker vessels and how does Canada and U.S. work together?
Yeah, so the icebreaker vessels are very cool, and I am not an expert. We do, however, have a group of our Coast Guard friends who are coming up for Arctic Encounter who would love to talk about icebreaker vessels. Our Coast Guard are not armed. Your Coast Guard are, ours are not. Ours have a very clear part of their mandate is very much about communities and about going out into communities and building trust with communities. And let me tell you, the guys I've met and the gals in the Coast Guard are absolutely phenomenal in this space. And they have learned all sorts of things about the ways in which large boats going into bays that didn't used to be open cause reverb in terms of noise, which lowers the presence of salmon who only come once a year or twice a year. And so how do we get around that? And a large part of their mandate is figuring out how to get the boats in at a time when it's not disruptive to the communities. Again, I'll just remind you the scope and scale of sort of the landmass that we're talking about, and that's where, as we bring these icebreakers online, the 4 new ones, but then also the 2 that will come later, so much of what they will be doing in that space is very much, as it were, uncharted ground because these are pathways and these are access points that weren't previously open, but also really trying to figure out how to do that in as secure and defendable way as possible while also very much resonating with the communities who are there. They work very, very closely with the U.S. Coast Guard, regularly inviting me to join their joint patrols, which I would love to do. I'm just trying to figure out how to justify it. And also like what I would wear and what my value would be. And, anyway, it's all kind of very interesting. And some of that is just about information sharing, and that is about figuring out how we all harness the eyes and ears on the ground or in the waters or on the ice, because particularly as it gets easier to navigate, you start to learn more things. Other people are also navigating in this space. The Chinese are very much in it with dual use and a variety of other things. The Russians are also very much in it. So the regular communication allows us to share that information, allows us to map that information, allows us to track with the science that is also helping us understand that information. And that's a big part of what the Coast Guard are doing with their partners. And then the real Coast Guard are actually going to be here this week, and they will tell you what they're really doing. But I think I've sort of given you at least a bit of a flavor of how that all comes together.
That's great. All right, staying on the national defense front, you mentioned hypersonic missiles as a threat. We often hear about potential adversaries carrying out training exercises off the shores of Alaska. And most recently, you know, we also think that has expanded into the Canadian activity. Have you seen more of this, and what is being done to secure both Canada and Alaska's front in this regard?
Yeah, great and very important and timely question. I mean, yes, absolutely, we are seeing it. We are seeing, as I mentioned, the presence of Chinese scientific vessels who have dual use, who report by virtue of Chinese law all of their findings to the Chinese government. We have seen, notwithstanding the enormous effort that Russia is putting into illegally invading Ukraine right now, and also uptick in Russia's involvement in the Arctic and their partnership with China as well in that space. Patrols off the shore of Alaska, you mentioned when I was in Elmendorf last year, I mean, it's pretty clear how close that is, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty clear how close that is. What we're doing in that space, we've just invested $8 billion and committed to $73 billion over 20 years. I would say a full third of that is explicitly about the Arctic, and then there's everything else that will also tangentially, or at least 50% be about the Arctic, because a long-range missile or a hypersonic, or a satellite or ocean sensors, I mean, this is all very much about that 40% of our land mass. The work we do in NORAD is also very much about that, and modernizing NORAD so that it can detect these new threats and so that it can actually adapt to what is no longer the conventional warfare that we saw in 1958. Balloons had their moment a year ago, hence the Brits understanding that we have a NORAD and thinking it's pretty cool. But that's an example of something, if you don't know what you're looking for, you're not looking for it. So let's make sure we have the tools that are actually looking for it. Let me tell you, we're looking for it. I'll leave it there, but
Yeah,
I think
no,
that's about the ballpark we're in.
Absolutely. Do you have another one, or you want
I
me to?
do.
Okay,
I do.
go ahead. And
So
then-
as we discussed, the Canadian government just announced a new defense policy called Our North Strong and Free.
Yes.
This consisted of investments to enhance Canada's Arctic defense capabilities and move Canada closer to NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target by 2030. However, discussions of Canada increasing its defense expenditures have been taking place for quite some time now, so 2% is the intended floor for NATO spending, not the ceiling. Can you tell us if and how this new policy will be enough to take Canadian defense capabilities up to par?
More softball questions. Okay, thank you.
Don't worry, the next
All right, so 2%. Yeah, we have, the Prime Minister agreed to 2% as the floor in Vilnius, and nobody is gonna claim that he did not. He does not claim that he did not. Canada also signed on to the Wales Pledge in 2014, and that is very much the pathway that we are on. The current investment, the $8 billion over 5 and the $73 billion over 20, takes us to 1.76 in the next 4 to 5 years. In 2013, we were under 1. If you look at the GDP of Canada, what that means in terms of what we have done to move that dial is quite enormous. The government has articulated in the defense policy update that we are not currently in a position to specify when we will go from 1.76 to 2, but the government has also been very clear, and the Prime Minister was very clear yesterday in his comments. We have committed to 2%, and we are committed to being on a pathway to get to 2%. Getting to 1.76 is a big chunk of that, and like I said, it builds on what has been over 10 years of continuous investment that has made it possible for us to get to 1.76 in this timeline. We're also on track to exceed the NATO goal of 20% for fixed assets through this particular investment. And we're also looking at a number of other ways in which to contribute. And so the trajectory is positive. and the trend line is very positive. And no, I don't have the date on which we're going to hit 2%, but I do have the date on which we're going to hit 1.76, and we have been consistently going up in the last 10 years, and that is the trend line that we're on.
Well, we have time for about one more question each, so I'm going to take 5 questions and combine it into one. No. There's been recognition of Canada's newly expanded oil pipeline to Vancouver. And can you talk a little bit about the tug vessels and different environmental protection zones that will be put in place to ensure that any of the response would be available for both the Northern Pacific to protect against such spills? And are there any other energy projects that could potentially cross our borders and help in energy security between Canada and Alaska? And while you're discussing that,
I might need to summarize this one.
can you talk about how the Indigenous people are being brought to the table to discuss the important energy issues? So.
Right, okay, so tugboats, no, I don't have the answer, but whoever asked that question, we will follow up with you with more information about the tugboats. You know, there's an interesting paradox in the energy security conversation, which is that by virtue of where the energy is in Canada, and that's 62% of your oil imports, it's 99% of your electricity imports, it's also 28% of uranium imports, and there's a few others in there. But by virtue of where it is, there is a need for there to be physical infrastructure in place. The Trans Mountain Pipeline that is going through to British Columbia, I wouldn't be surprised if California buys a lot of it. So that is a conversation that is ongoing as that comes on stream. There was a pipeline that isn't going to be built. We don't have to go into details on that one. Some of the more current and very much coming, as it were, online or on stream is the electricity infrastructure, but that's more on the East Coast. And so as we kind of look at the impacts of what happens as the Trans Mountain Pipeline comes on stream, I think this is very much a conversation about demand and supply, and where are there more opportunities. Energy producing provinces, and there is no conversation about energy security with the United States without Canada, frankly, but also without the provinces and the territories where all of these resources are held, are always very interested in new destinations for these exports. And so as we sort of figure out what the needs are and where the partnerships are, I would say the relationship that Alaska has with the territory of Yukon, the relationship that Alaska has with the province of British Columbia is a very important place for those conversations to happen as people start to map what those supply chains are, where there needs to be more, and what some of those solutions are.
I think you covered it all.
Okay.
Okay.
It's summary.
Okay.
One quick one. Who's really going to win the 2024 Stanley Cup? I'm just kidding. That is a question, but I'll keep it soft.
I am a Montrealer, and therefore it must be the Habs. 1993 was our year. I'm also an Expos fan. 1993 was our year. Anyway.
All right, very good, very good. This does actually follow up with some of the things that you were pointing out in this last answer. You mentioned Canada is the U.S. #1 trading partner. Next week, the U.S. International Trade Commission is partnering with local regional governments and partners to hold Canada Arctic Industry Days in Yellowknife, bringing U.S. businesses to meet with businesses and government officials. Is there specific commercial opportunities that come to mind for partnerships in the Arctic?
That's a great question. So Canada is the largest purchaser of U.S. exports. We are not the largest seller to the United States. We buy more of your stuff. Arguably, that's more important, I think, to you. But anyway, I would say the opportunities are almost limitless. I think by virtue of knowing each other, by virtue of having these heavily integrated already value chains and commercial spaces, be it from vehicles or agricultural or value-added or mining or oil and gas or services, the opportunities are limitless. We all have an interest in trading as much as possible. Canada very much sees it as important to trade as much as possible with as wide a variety of actors as possible within the limits of what is appropriate from a national security perspective. And I think that is very much where the Canada-US trade relationship is so fundamentally important to us. A number of the folks who I spoke to last time I was in Alaska are looking at opportunities from a wide range of sectors. I mean, be it seafood, be it agricultural, be it fiber optics, be it services in the mining sector, be it a wide range of petroleum and oil and gas initiatives. I'm not going to pick a handful of sectors. I'm going to say that the sky's the limit on this, really, in terms of what two trusted partners who know each other, whose governments know each other, whose subnational governments know each other, and whose people are really interested in the benefits and the economic opportunities that come from a free and open trading relationship without protectionism to make that complicated, and without unnecessary legislative hurdles that somehow lump Canada in with actors who aren't necessarily in that bucket who you are trying to keep out.
Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you for the
And
opening.
No problem.
please join me in another round of applause for Sara Cohen, Deputy Ambassador.
Actually, I have one last question for you.
Yeah,
By point of privilege.
Yeah,
Is Parks Canada doing any work on the Franklin expedition this summer, and are they taking volunteer applications?
Ooh, I don't know, but I would like to go as well. I sort of nerded out. I flew over where they found some of the wreckage from Franklin, and I sort of nerded out about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll find out for you.
All right,
We'll figure that out,
we can,
yeah.
we can definitely have a nerdy conversation about that. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Especially thank you to Lisa Eiler and World Affairs Council for partnering with us on this event. To Ambassador Cohen and the consulate team, Natalie and Megan from the Seattle office, as well as Marianne Peace with MAP Consulting, Honorary Consul General and a Board Emeritus member. And please also join me in thanking ConocoPhillips Alaska and Alaska Communications again as our sponsors for today's event.